Right, as said before, hello everyone. Welcome to the Food History Seminar for 2024 to 2025. We're really pleased to bring today Ran Mei from New York University, and she will be talking to us about stir-fry urbanism, geography of Chinese restaurants, and the spatial politics of race and identity in Boston's urban development from 1880 to 2020. So Ran, if you'd like to put up your slides and then get started whenever you're ready.
Oh yeah. Well, before I pull out my slides, I just want to say thank you, Matt, Brandy, and Kelly, for inviting me here. It is such an honor to be presenting my work at HR, and um, and I'm just very grateful. And I want to limit my talk as suggested to under 30 minutes, so we will have plenty of time for discussions and comments, because this is more about me, like, hearing from you what I need to improve as much as I want to share this work. Okay, let me share screen. Okay, so a little bit about myself before jumping into the presentation. My name is Ran, and I'm currently a second-year PhD student in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at NYU. This is my first time presenting this project to a public audience, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments about this project. And this project is very special for me because it started as an MA thesis at the Harvard Graduate School of Design when I was doing urban studies. And with a background in architecture and urban planning, I was particularly interested in the issues of space, place, and identity, or putting another way, how meaning is constructed through the built environment, who gets to shape these meanings, and for whom it benefits. And food and restaurant kind of became like a natural and powerful medium to tackle these issues. One thing that I argue is food and restaurants, and I think many of you in this room would resonate, is that food is one of the most direct, physical, and embodied ways in which identities are expressed and consumed. But then the question is, why Chinese restaurants? Well, first of all, I just want to say, as a Chinese person who came to the United States 14 years ago, it was striking for me to find out there are so many Chinese restaurants in this country. Um, when I looked into statistics, it was surprising for me to find that there are over 45,000 Chinese restaurants in the United States, which is more than all the McDonald's, KFC's, Wendy's, and Taco Bell's combined. But when you look at the demographics of Chinese population in this country, it was actually kept constantly under 1% of the total US population, and kept under 1% of Boston's total population until 1980s. By the time that the share of Chinese restaurant out of all restaurants in Boston skyrocketed to over 12% in 1990, the share of Chinese immigrant takes up only 0.5% of the total Boston population, and a little over 2% if you include all the ethnic Chinese regardless of their place of birth. Another striking thing about Chinese restaurant for me that really drew my interest is this like consistent branding of their Chineseness. One thing is that you can't really mistake a Chinese restaurant for anything else. It was expressed through their signage, their interior space, the iconic Chinese restaurant menu that fills every corner of the page. Um, why? Why is it so distinctly and consistently Chinese? So my initial question that started this project was, what explains the ubiquity of Chinese restaurant in the US and its contrast with the marginal size of the Chinese population in this country? and what explains the distinctive branding of Chineseness in these restaurants in Boston, which is where I was when I was doing this research. And I want to look as closely as possible. That's why I chose Boston, or narrowed it down to Boston. Well, another reason that I chose Boston is because I find the literature on Chinese restaurant in the North American context are kind of focus mostly on the coast areas, even though Boston is on the coast areas, but Boston relatively is understudied. So I kind of took it as a chance to intervene. So to answer these questions, I traced every single Chinese restaurant from its first appearance on Boston's public record, which is the city directories, in 1880, all the way to 2020. And then map the location of all Chinese restaurant that has ever appeared on Boston city directories onto the city's urban landscape in relations with the residence and occupation of every single individual who was recorded as Chinese by race on the US federal census records. So if you zoom, well, I don't know if I can zoom into it. Oh, actually I can. So if you look at the map in 1880, they listed 138 Chinese people categorized under race in Boston. There are over 100 of them who are working in laundries, which are showing as little red dots onto the map. And there are 9 cigar, tobacco, and tea merchants that are shown in the green square. In 1910s, however, the population of Chinese in Boston grew by more than tenfold to 1,200, more than 1,200 in 2 decades. And more than half of this population were working in laundries, and they're spread all across the city. There are 240 merchants, which is a huge increase from only 9 in 1880s. Well, what these 2 maps shows was that Chinese people started to disperse all over the city as early as the 1910s, decades before the stereotypical portrayal of the Chinese living in insular and introverted ethnic enclaves of Chinatown, which is here, until they were pushed outside of the city by massive urban renewal effort in Boston in the 1950s. When we move into 1930s, the population of all Chinese in Boston didn't grow that much in size, even though compared to the base number, it still grew significantly, a little bit about 40% in 2 decades. But at this time, 401 persons were registered as working in laundries, while 410 people were working in restaurants. Well, this shows you that somewhere around 1930s, restaurants outnumbered laundry as the dominant place of work for the Chinese in Boston. With the spatialization of Chinese restaurant data and the demographic data of the Chinese population in Boston through the past 140 years, I was able to go back and look at the statistics and percentage of Chinese restaurant in the overall Boston industry and periodize the history of Chinese restaurant by its rise and falls over the past century and a half. And to make sense of this history part by zooming into individual restaurants that are archetypes of each era. So by digging into the archives, I was able to find 6 archetypes of Chinese restaurant that characterize the rise and falls over the history of the Chinese restaurant industry in Boston. Each of the archetypes has a specific location in the city. Each features a unique design in their architecture and interiors. They have a different menu, a different story and tells a different story about the Chinese in Boston during that time and their relationship with the city. For the sake, because this presentation is limited and I want to get as much detail as possible from this one case study, I will only be presenting to you one archetype, which is Hong Fa Lo, that characterized the first generation of Chinese restaurant in Boston. And I want to use this case to highlight my argument that Boston's Chinese restaurants has not only functioned as the essential means of economic survival, but also key spaces for cultural production and political mobilization that enable the Chinese diasporas to negotiate their belonging and carve out spaces of living and livelihood in Boston, which in turn shaped the city into what it looks like today. Okay, so Hong Fa Lo. It was the first and earliest record of Chinese restaurant that appeared on Boston City Directory in 1880. The name Hong Fa Lo, which literally translate into, quote, red flower restaurant in Cantonese, or almond blossom fragrance in Taishanese dialect. The restaurant is located at 34 Harrison Ave in the neighborhood known as the South Cove, or what we today know as Boston's Chinatown. By the time that Hong Fa Lo opened its doors on 1879, as it claimed on the doorway, the South Cove has transformed from a neighborhood built on a landfill in 1940s for the railroads and row houses into tenement homes for new immigrants, mostly at the time Irish, German, and Jewish immigrants. Hong Fa Lo was one of the first Chinese businesses that started to settle in South Cove since the 1880s. As a key trading port in tea, tobacco, and other exotics from the treaty ports in southern China / Canton, Boston attracted a group of Chinese merchants who were exempt from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, as well as the Chinese workers who were fleeing from the rampant anti-Chinese sentiments and violence in the West during the time. The merchants set up shops and restaurants in South Cove where rent was relatively cheap and their location conveniently close to the streetcar lines, which you can see here, and which then connects to transport goods and people from Boston's seaports to the east and train stations to the south. The name and location, as well as the architecture of Hong Fa Lo, suggests that Chinese restaurants in the early 1900s were mostly catering to the Chinese merchant class, who has the power and the resources to travel between US and China during the exclusionary era. Typically of 2 floors, the ground level was open to regular customers, while the upper floors was reserved exclusively for special guests. These were lavishly decorated spaces with a strict hierarchical layout. The interior of Hong Fa Lo was decorated with, as I quote from this article, polished, shining ebony tables, elaborate ebony framed lanterns, and decorations imported from China that, according to the Boston Southern Globes, is both tasty and costly. Well, it's not clear if the owner of the restaurant is actually named Hong Fa Lo, as the reporter suggested, or whether it is his actual face on the menu. But it's very likely that the owner of Hong Fa Lo was also a member of the elite merchants class at the time. In the same newspaper article by the Boston Sunday Globes published in 1893, the owner of Hong Fa Lo has been in America for 4 to 5 years. However, speaks no English, but he's a very, I quote, capable man of business. He's not a chef, but hires 4 cooks and 6 waiters. The restaurant opens from 7 in the morning to 10 at night, which is unusually long hours for restaurants at the time. And based on the report, it served not only the Chinese, but also Americans, even though it's kind of hard to imagine Americans ordering from his, I quote, oral menus. Well, they actually do have a written menu, and it's in English, perhaps later adapted for American customer base. The food at Hong Fa Lo was quite expensive. There was the famous chop suey, as the owner proudly claimed that he was the first man in Boston who ever made chop suey, in 1879. So there was the promised chop suey on the menu, which some of you might already know this, as I quote from Jennifer A. Lee, refers to chop suey as the, I quote, the biggest culinary joke that one culture ever played on another, because it literally translates as odds, bits, and ends of foodstuffs. But the chicken chop suey on Home Fallow's menu cost 75 cents, which is almost $28 in today's money. In comparison, a sirloin steak at the Manhattan Club in 1900s cost only 65 cents. Well, it's hard for me to imagine there was a time that chop suey was more expensive than steak in Manhattan. However, there were also cheaper dishes, such as plain rice and rice with maple syrup for 10 cents. My guess was that it probably served as a quick energy boost for the average workers in the Chinatown area who needed to feed themselves after a long day of work and very quickly. However, it's worth noting that the same newspaper report that described Home Fallow in such details was written as an expose of the rich Chinese elites who were not really caring about the recently announced Gary Act. And the message that this report sent is that even the rich elites in Boston needs to be removed and to reinforce their expulsion under the Gary Act of 1892. One of the examples of, I quote, Chinatown Mongols exposed by the reporter was a Chinese merchant named Sang Wang Li, known, I quote, by every US official in Boston as the King of Chinatown. Is said to have over $75,000 in wealth, which is roughly equal to $2.6 million in today's money. Under the Chinese Exclusion Acts, the Chinese merchant class were the only ones who were able to travel between US and China and to bring goods and products and their wives and children and recruited workers from China. These workers are registered, if you look at the records, as partners, which is a common strategy to circumvent the Chinese Exclusion Act. These partners are often working class Chinese people who paid a fee to be brought into the U.S. And for those who could not afford the fee, they will be paying back their debts with their labor by working in their creditors' restaurants or shops, or as servants in their households. So the highlighted area is actually showing the households, like all the individuals that's registered in the same households as the King of Chinatown, as exposed by this report. While the Chinese merchant class was able to capitalize under special exemptions from the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was a large population of poor Chinese people who fled into Boston from rampant anti-Chinese violence in the West and massive civil wars and famines at home. From 1880 to 1930, the Chinese population in Boston grew more than tenfold. They were the lucky ones who made it through the scrutiny of US border, but they were barred from citizenship under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1875. They're barred from property ownership from the Alien Land Laws of 1913. They're prohibited to enter more than 20 occupations under the Massachusetts state laws, and their job opportunities are further restricted because they were denied membership from Boston's trade unions, which was necessary for most skilled and professional work. If you zoom into the maps, you can see that most of the restaurants and laundry workers were actually living closer to, were living in proximity closer to South Cove, their place of work, and most of the merchants and professionals were living further south into the quiet suburbs of Hyde Park, Dorchester, and Hyde Park. And the geography of Chinese restaurants during the exclusionary era, which are shown in blue, as like a concentration and distribution of Chinese restaurants across the urban landscape, follows the elites and started to spread out of Chinatown. It was under this nested system of exclusivity for the elites and the larger system of racial exclusion against the Chinese working class that the first generation of Chinese restaurant took off in Boston from 1880 to 1930. Hong Fa-lo, serving as the pioneer and architect for the first generation of Chinese restaurant in Boston, which were owned and operated by the merchant class on the back of their servants and cooks, which often had to rely on this restaurant for economic survival and protection from anti-Chinese sentiments and violence institutionalized by the Chinese exclusion laws. It was also under this context that Chinese restaurants became key sites of political mobilization, interracial and interethnic encounters, as well as community building for the larger Chinese diaspora communities in Boston. While Chinese merchants used their restaurants to establish their legitimacy and to negotiate their place of belonging in the dominant American society. They invited governors, police chiefs, war doctors, Christian missionaries, poor American soldiers, and even the cardinal to wine and dine in their restaurant. They hosted lavish banquets for Boston city officials and business elites with expensive Chinese delicacies such as shark's wings, and bird's nest soup paired with French champagne and German liqueur. They celebrated Americans' victory at Manila Bay by raising a gigantic American flag in front of Hong Fa-lo and hired a band to play patriotic airs, in quotes. They created, and continue to quote, a scene never to be forgotten, attracting fully 30,000 people from all over the city and suburbs to the neighborhood. During a banquet at Hong Fa-lo at the end of the event, the Chinese merchant, even credited the events to the then Boston Mayor Queenie and his colleagues. For the Chinese merchants, these restaurants were also the place where New Year's Day is celebrated, where they gather to discuss matters of public good, and where they hold religious services. Chinese restaurants were as important a place for political engagement as for community building for the Chinese diasporas themselves. By the 1930s, though, the face of Hong Fa-lo suddenly changed from a picture of a stern, bold man in traditional Chinese attire, looking straight in your eyes and proudly announcing him as the first man in Boston who made chop suey in 1879, into an image of a young Chinese woman in the trendiest hairstyle of the time and looking softly at her audience with an enchanting smile. What happened in the 1930s marked the first turn in Boston's Chinese restaurant from places mainly catered to the Chinese merchant elites to open its doors to the larger American middle class. But why? How did it change the spaces and architecture of the restaurants and the roles that Chinese restaurant played in the city of Boston and the larger Chinese diaspora communities? Well, these questions has to be answered by zooming out from the restaurant scale and back to the urban and political scale, where the Great Depression and the World Wars transformed the US and China relations and US immigration laws from the 1930s and on. And for the sake of time, I'm going to end right here. But before we open it up to questions and comments, I just want to quickly acknowledge that there is a sizable and growing body of scholarship on the history of Chinese restaurant in the Northern American context, which has been incredibly inspiring and helpful for this research. But what I hope to contribute to this literature is to offer a spatial dimension for the understanding of Chinese restaurants in the diasporas. By spatial dimension, I mean not only the location of restaurants that tells the story about their relationship with the city and their neighborhoods, but also the food, the architecture, and spaces that this restaurant created that structures meaning. Restaurants are the places where the politics and poetics of food and architecture intersects and becomes a reflection and shaper of identities. Decades of work on immigrant food and foodways has made us realize that Chinese restaurants, as well as many other marginalized ethnic cuisines, are integral part of the American culinary landscape. However, it's often forgotten that these restaurants are not only tastemakers, they're also city makers. By spatializing the history of Chinese restaurant in Boston from multiple scales, I want to show that these are part and parcel of the city-making process in Boston as well. Thank you.